All right, welcome back to the program. In case you're just joining us, it's time for our conversation right now. At the beginning of the program, I did say we'll be looking at Budget 2020, that's 2020 Appropriation Bill right now as it stands before the National Assembly, and what's in there for businesses across the country. You need to really be interested in the budget, just like I said a few days ago, or Monday or so. I've been saying it this week anyway, because it also affects you and I. My guests are with me at the table. To my immediate right is Ayo-Bankole. He's a strategy consultant and SME expert. Welcome, Ayo, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Nancy. Thanks for having me.
Nonso Obikili is to my far right. He is an economist. He's also a director at Target Center for Economic and Policy Research. Welcome, Nonso, and thanks for joining me.
Happy to be here.
So both of you, let me have your, what your perspectives are concerning this budget. Now, so let me start with you.
Well, the difficult part is the revenue expectations. The government expects to raise revenue of 8 trillion in 2020, which seems very optimistic. I think the largest we've done is about just below 4 trillion. Based on the half year for 2019, we've done 2 trillion in the half year. So it's difficult to see how they would get to 8 trillion in 2020, even despite all the revenue generating initiatives. And if they don't, then we're back to the same old scraping to pay salaries and then whatever is left is spent. So that's my real concern for the budget, the revenue aspect.
Revenue generation. Ayo, what are your concerns?
My major concern really is the focus of the budget. It doesn't provide sufficiently for development sectors that are required to drive the required growth that we need in the economy. So allocations to health, for example, to education are they're very low. And then if you also look at the estimates for oil production, I think is rather too optimistic. If you look at the budget for social investment programs, they've been slashed by over 90%. So it's like, and then you are increasing a lot of taxes. So you are essentially setting SMEs up to fail. And the average Nigerian, and you know that Nigeria is now the largest, is now the highest, is now the poverty capital of the world. So you are essentially setting people up to fail. And I mean, it's not good. It's not good for the economy and for the those at the bottom of the pyramid.
So do you agree with Ayo that perhaps this budget is already setting up businesses and people to fail in that sense, total failure? Isn't there something in the budget that really caters even for small businesses?
Well, I don't particularly think so. I think I would agree that we would like to see more spending on health and education and security as opposed to some of the other things. But I don't think the fate of SMEs is determined by the budget. The government spends only about 8% of GDP, which is very big, but it's not the be-all and end-all of the economy. So it's a relatively small fraction of overall spending in the economy. So yes, it will have an impact, and yes, I would agree that I would like to see more spending on education and health as opposed to some other things. But I don't think it will be that dramatic for SMEs. I think the big part for SMEs would be the tax initiatives, which might change the profitability of some of these SMEs. But there's already been a statement that the VAT increase, for example, will be limited to firms who have a turnover above 25 million, which would limit the impact on SMEs. And there have been some things that have been restricted from the VAT, which might also help SMEs. But I don't think it matters that much for SMEs in terms of where the government is spending, just because the amount of money government is spending is relatively small, relative to the size of the economy. I think the real part is the tax initiatives and how that will impact how SMEs can be profitable and survive going forward.
Okay, some people have also argued that this VAT impacts on SMEs, which the president did mention in the speech, as in we are talking about the 25 million turnover. For those perhaps below 25 million, they are exempt from some, that's VAT charges, so to speak. Isn't that a commendable one also coming at this time for SMEs?
Yes, it is quite commendable because the biggest concern was how the increment was going to impact on transactions for SMEs and increase costs because, of course, a lot of our SMEs buy or trade a lot of processed items that are vatable. So, yeah, that is indeed a welcome development. But of course, we know how a lot of these things impact indirectly. So yes, that on the one side. I also agree with Nonso that the budget in itself is not the ultimate determinant for SME progress or otherwise. But again, you also know that you have to look at the economy in its actual context. The biggest spender in Nigeria is the government, and if the government is giving a direction that shows that is strategic focus is not really in development areas, one way or the other, it will impact a lot of transactions. The SME space in Nigeria provides about 48% to our GDP. So there is no way you can, you can't overemphasize the impact, the necessity for government spending to put into consideration the SME space and those who are within the middle to the lower end of the pyramid. But yes, it's a fantastic initiative. It's a welcome development that you're excluding 25 million revenue. But of course, don't forget that CBN also pegged SMEs as those who went between 100 million and below. So what that means is that you still have 75% of those in that bracket, 75 million, those with between 26 and 75 million excluded from the VAT based on CBN's description of
what
SMEs.
An SME is.
Yeah.
If we also take a look at, are you both really saying, let me really get to you, are you both really saying that this budget doesn't matter for MSMEs?
No, I'm not.
Or it does not?
Well, it matters,
okay,
right? But there are a lot of things that matter as well, much more than the budget. The policy environment, for example, is probably much more important than whatever the government spends. If you have a policy environment that is hostile to businesses, then whether the government spends or not doesn't really make that much difference, because if businesses cannot operate, then businesses suffer.
But
right?
from this budget, the government would also spend on infrastructure that would help enable business. For example, yes, building roads is also a critical enabler of growth in businesses. So this budget also caters for building roads. Would you say that will not even affect MSMEs at all?
Well, that's kind of the problem with the revenue side. So typically, when revenue doesn't meet up, the thing that gets cut first is capital expenditure. If you look at the trends over the last few years, we've actually been spending less and less as a share of the budget on infrastructure. That's because once you service debts, you have to service debts. You can't negotiate that. You have to pay salaries. You can't negotiate that. So once the revenue doesn't meet up, capital expenditure gets cut. And so even though the government says it's going to spend 2 trillion on capital expenditure, it's never spent more than 1.2 trillion or so in any year, right? And so it's one thing to have a budget that says we want to spend this. It's another thing to actually do it. So I think, yes, if you think about things like infrastructure, if the government spends more on roads, on transport infrastructure, then that would help SMEs a bit more. I agree with that. But again, it's one thing to say we're going to spend, it's another thing to actually spend. Because if there's no money to spend, then...
Ayo, as an SME expert, what do you think that really should be done? Perhaps beyond what we've been talking about, because as it is right now, we have 41.6 million MSMEs, at least from the new data from NBS and SMEDAN that was conducted. So SMEs in the country have increased from 37 million to 41.6 million MSMEs. And when I analyzed that, I think months ago, about 2 months ago that the data was released, about 41.5 million are micro enterprises.
Yes.
Micro, not small,
yes.
Micro enterprises. What does it really say for the structure of our economy, as well as perhaps what government should be doing beyond what we are talking about, beyond policies, beyond enabling environment, beyond all of that? Are there some other things that perhaps are in there that we're not seeing? So I've asked you 2 questions.
Okay, so I need to provide a little bit of context to this. In addition to the absolute figure of SMEs that we have in Nigeria, it's also instructive to know that about, I think, 68% of them have startup capitals of less than 10 million, right? And most of those capitals are drawn from their personal savings. And again, a large majority of them, 9 out of 10, would fail, before 5 years. So important to them is funding, and funding again, either from government or by government stimulating growth and channels of making these funds available, right? And if you look at the budget, for example, critics had come up to say that the social investment program was a political weapon, the intention was not genuine and all of that. But again, it helped a whole lot to drive to provide some form of financing to those at the micro end. But then the ARGP planned that we're going to be spending $500 billion on this initiative every year. And for the past 3 years, we've spent less than $500 million. And then this year, suddenly, you are slashing it down to $30 billion.
A social investment program?
Yes, the social investment program. You're slashing it to $30 billion, meaning that you don't intend to provide such support anymore. I mean, there are so many questions. But if
government has the intention, with what Nonso said, there's a revenue challenge.
Okay, so again, I was speaking about VAT recently. So there's a revenue challenge, right? What is the approach that government has adopted to increase revenue? Government wants to increase VAT. What is the percentage contribution of VAT to revenue, to our total revenue, right? Even to taxes. It's just about 20-25%, right? Now, economies have shown history is littered with examples of economies that have generated revenue for the government by even cutting taxes. Nothing says that you have to increase taxes to increase revenue. If you stimulate growth in the economy, if you spend big on infrastructure, for example, there are lots. Now let's look at the budget, for example. You have about 220 billion, 110 billion to judiciary, 125 billion to Senate. That's about the same amount you want to spend on works and housing. Is like 4 times more than what you want to spend on education. Is 4 times more than what you want to spend on health. And these are critical sectors that will drive a lot of activities, economic activities, because where we are, if you spend big on health, spend big on road, spend big on education, you are going to drive a lot of activities. Look at construction sites, for example. Wherever you have construction activities, you see a lot of it becomes a sort of hub of economic activities. Meanwhile, there are also lots of, if you also look at MBS has provided some data for us that those SME guys, top 5 SME segments, are guys who play in retail, in health, in construction. Small guys who provide inputs to this system. So you can then see that there's a direct link between spending in those segments and and the SME space. So there is no doubting the fact. It's not so much about, yes, we don't have money. But what approaches are we adopting to make money? And the little money that we have, where are we spending it? We are spending more financing our political system than we are spending on the critical development sectors.
So you want to come in? I would also want you to touch a bit on what I asked earlier, the structure of perhaps the SME space in the country, which should also be troubling. Troubling in the sense that how can we have 41.6 million MSMEs and about 41.5 million of them are micro? Perhaps a lot of people have been out of jobs. They're looking for stuff to do. Perhaps, do you understand? They are like soft ways to be able to just stay afloat, and you're creating a lot more of micro enterprises, just like you said. Perhaps a lot more even in retail, the Akarasela by the wayside, the PhD holder that has not gotten a job but just wants to ride an Okada and all of that. I know you understand what I'm saying.
Yes, and I agree with you. And look, for the most part, these micro enterprises are survival strategies. People do them just to survive. And they are evidence that the economy isn't functioning as well as it should. I think we focus a lot on the fact that we have a lot of micro enterprises, but we really don't have a lot of big companies. We don't have a lot of big companies that can export in international markets. We don't have a lot of big companies that can create those kind of thousands of jobs that we want to see. And so we need to start to see the micro enterprises as, some of them are productive and doing a lot of engaging a lot of economic activity, but many of them are just survival strategies. People just doing something to survive. And if you have an economy that's functioning, you probably would not see that there. at least not to that scale. And in terms of taxes, let's be honest. The federal government collects very little taxes from the economy, and it needs to collect more. And collecting more means some people will feel the pinch. That's clear. But like you said, the debate has to go not just with how can we raise revenues, but also to how can we spend better. Right? Because it's one thing to collect revenues, but if you throw it down the rabbit hole like we do, then we are really just moving around in circles. You have to, if you want to collect more revenue, you have to also explain how you want to spend better. But you also have to think about it in a sustainable context, right? Businesses need to get financed, yes, but can we envision an economy where government finances businesses? No. The financial sector has to evolve to finance businesses, right? For health and education, we want government to spend more there, but we always typically forget that the states and local governments actually should be spending more as well. And we have a lot of information on how much the federal government spends, but there's very little information on how much states and local government spends. So while we're shining light on the federal government, we also need to shine the lights on state and local governments. How are you spending on education? How are you spending on health? Are you doing it efficiently? Are you doing it better? And yes, we need to cut a lot of waste. And people point to the National Assembly as the big, and say, well, we give them 150 billion every year, what do they do with it? And yes, it sounds like it's an emotional argument because it looks unfair. But the reality is, even if we cut their budget to zero, it won't change the dynamics of our funding problems. We need to look at the big spending wastages, like fuel subsidy. We don't know how much we spend because it's incorporated inside NMPC. But we know it's a lot more than what we spend on health and education, and it kind of doesn't make that much sense. Can we cut waste there? We have a lot of...
the cost of governance itself, even among the executive.
You have a lot of agencies that exist that don't actually do anything, but you have budget allocations every year, lots of real estate. These are assets that could be put to better use. So yes, we need to spend better, but let's be clear. The government needs to raise more taxes, and raising more taxes means that people will have to pay more, and there will be some costs.
Government needs to raise more taxes, or is it deepening the tax base more?
Expanding the tax net.
It's a bit of both. It's a bit of both.
So
right?
you are for that VAT rates, for example, should be increased, as well as, are you saying the VAT rate, from the president's speech is going to be increased to 7.5%. Are you saying, fine, you support that, and also expand the tax base?
Well, I support it, but there are also lots of reforms that need to go into the VAT. What we do in Nigeria is not really a VAT, because for a VAT, you're supposed to add a tax on the value added. But what we do is we tax just the price of whatever is sold and call it VAT. So it's not just about increasing the rate, it's about reforming the entire VAT structure. And of course, improving compliance. Right? Compliance is the big issue. If you increase the VAT, but only the small fraction of firms pay, then you're going to keep on putting pressure on the small fraction, while the rest who don't pay, they don't care. Right? So as we look at increasing the rates, we need to look at compliance as well. For the VAT, it's 5%, which is very, very low. And so you can't really argue that moving to 7.5% is a big negative policy. But at the same time, for the federal government, the VAT doesn't really matter for its finances. I think the states and local governments get 85% of VAT. And so, it's good for the states and local government, but for the federal government's funding, it won't really make that much difference.
Now, the question is, what should the states be doing right now? Because just like you said, we concentrate a lot on the federal government, but there are a lot of things that the states should be doing, and perhaps Nigerians should also be turning their searchlights to the state governments. What should the states begin to do to build SMEs? Because you also mentioned, just like we also said, 41.5 million MSMEs in the country are micro, so that means there's a dysfunctionality existing in our system. So it shouldn't be something we should even be so proud of, because if you take a look at China, for example, a lot of their MSMEs are very big. They produce like some chips even in this phone. A house like this can just be producing this thing, and they are exporting to the rest of the world. Those are the kind of SMEs we should build, and perhaps bring them also to the medium and to the large companies. So what should the states be doing to contribute their own quota to building the kind of ecosystem that will support the growth of small businesses in their various states?
Okay,
away from Lagos, because Lagos has a lot of chunk of these MSMEs.
I think that conversation around states and other component units has a lot of has a lot to do with the structure of our governance system, of our political system. Is very faulty, right? And I really disagree with a lot of Nonso's views on taxation and revenue generation and all of that. And that's because, first and foremost, you don't necessarily have to collect taxes, VAT especially at the center, and allocate to people, or allocate to states. It's a handout system, right? That's the same thing we do for resources, mineral resources, for example. Nothing stops us. If restructuring is the problem, the name is the problem, let's look for something else to call it, and create an economic model that is more sustainable at the states and at the center. Now, for example, if you go to the US, usually I don't like to compare US, I prefer to compare African countries, and I will come to African countries. But let's start with the US. US does not have a national VAT. They have sales taxes imposed by various states at different rates, right? They haven't died. Now, in the United States, there is a place called, there's a borderline, there's a place called Nogales. It's the same town, but has a border between the US and Mexico, right? And the other part is far underdeveloped, even though they pay 16% VAT in that country. While the US, that does not have a national VAT, is far more developed. So there's nothing that says that you have to increase taxes to maintain high level of development. And look at Ronald Reagan, for example, implemented one of the biggest tax cuts in America and grew revenue from about $350 billion to about $550 billion. Now, that doesn't mean that cutting taxes is not a way of increasing revenue. I'm just saying, is that the major problem? Tax compliance rate in Nigeria is just about 12%. VAT collection, Lagos alone contributes 55%. Abuja contributes 25%, right? So that's already almost 80% from just 2 locations. So there is a huge problem with VAT, with tax collection. So it's really about doing the hard work required to expand the tax net. It's not so much about how much we pay. Yes, how much we pay is low, but when you put it in context against other African countries, for example, we go to Egypt, we say Egypt pays, I think, 16%, right? But
yeah, but Nigeria pays one of the lowest in Africa.
But Nigeria also has one of the poorest infrastructure index in Africa. So a lot of our businesses are paying a lot of indirect taxes that others don't pay. I will give you an example. Egypt ranks about 82% on the African Infrastructure Development Index, right? Meaning SMEs don't have to pay extra for transport, for example. They don't have to pay extra for power because there's power, and a lot of other things. Nigeria ranks 22%, even below Ghana, below Rwanda, countries that have far below South Africa. So, and when you are poor on infrastructure, even look at transport index also, we are just at about 6%, right? As against 60% of Egypt and the like. So when you look at all of this your ability to provide all of these tools that you need to do your business properly and be profitable, you see that Nigerians are spending far more in terms of indirect taxes than the other people from all of these other economies that we compare ourselves with. And when you now look at all of that, you see that there is very little the states can do, and by the time you increase this revenue, you are going to end up spending it in the same model that has brought us to where we are. The president gave us, the Minister of Finance, I beg your pardon, said that one of the things that they are going to use the increment of revenue for is to share among the states to help them with salary payments. I mean, that's ridiculous. You can't increase revenue to give bailouts again to pay recurrent. So in terms of the structure, there is a fundamental problem with our economic structure in terms of the states. Look at Zamfara. We have mining going on in Zamfara state. Illegal mining, making a lot of money. The federal government obviously is busy with oil. Allow the states, take some of these, maybe allow them administer VAT, for example, allow them control a percentage of their revenues. They will be more competitive, they will be more creative, right? Yes, they can do better even with the current structure, no doubt. And we need to look critically at what they are doing. But then the way we are right now, there is a huge room for improvement in our economic model and our socio-political governance structure.
No, so just before, I know you want to react, but just before that, it seems this economic model is just an issue, that we really need to begin to rethink our economic model, our economic model in totality. And just like I said, was it yesterday or when the government announced the appointment of the EAC, Economic Advisory Council, in terms of advising the president. I know that that group of 8, G8 now, Nigeria G8, would have a lot of work to do, because perhaps what kind of advice will you even give the president? Are they going to be short-term, mid-term, or long-term kind of advices that will also need to just restructure the economy? So add that to what you want to say.
Yes. I mean, just to say, I don't think all taxes need to be increased. I think the corporate income tax, for example, is too high.
You think what?
The corporate income tax is too high.
CIT.
CIT. I think there are a lot of other taxes like education tax and the new police tax
levy 0.005
add to the tax burden that are not good for the tax system. I agree with that, but I still think VAT is too low. Yeah, and I think for VAT it can be increased, others can be reduced. But I think we have a political problem with our tax structure, right? In the 80s, we had a different tax problem. The problem in the 80s was we have all this oil revenue, how do we distribute it equally and fairly to give everybody a chance? That was the problem in the 80s. But that's the tax structure that we still have today. And we don't have the resources to distribute for everybody. And we need to move from that distributional structure to a structure that is more in line with economic growth, economic activity, so that everybody has an incentive to be active. But there's a political problem there. And like you mentioned earlier in the show, economic activity is clustered in Lagos, in Abuja, and in a few states, right? So any movement to a more economic activity-related tax distribution means many states lose money automatically. And every state knows this. From, I don't want to call states, but majority of states will lose money if you move to a tax structure like you suggested, because economic activity is clustered in very particular places, which is a political problem. I don't think anybody has an answer of how to deal with that, because, you know, like they say, chickens never vote for Christmas, or is it turkeys never vote for Christmas? No politician will vote for a tax plan that will reduce the allocation to their states. It's not going to happen. So how do you improve the tax collection structure to deal with very present challenges while thinking about how to reform this process politically? I don't know. But I still think, given that we only collect, for federal government, it's about 4 or 5% of GDP. If you include states, it's about 8 or 9% of GDP in taxes. Overall, we need to collect more, overall. Because an economy cannot survive sustainably without public services. And we see it every day. You cannot privatize security, right? It's a public service that the society needs to provide. You cannot privatize infrastructure. You need roads. It needs to be provided. And so it's not just a case of government should figure out how to do it and leave us alone. It's a case of we as a country have to figure out how do we provide for public services. It's not a APC or PDP thing, not a Buhari or National Assembly thing. It's a Nigeria problem. We don't know how to fund public goods in Nigeria, and we need to start to do that. We can wait for a chicken and egg situation and say, well, government needs to provide first before they increase taxes. But where's the government going to get money from? It's the real problem. We can see the budget. I talked about how they can't fund the 8 trillion they expect. We know that debt servicing is already about 25% of their expected revenue. And so we know the government does not have funding. So if we wait for the government to somehow miraculously provide the rules, somehow miraculously provide security before we raise taxes, that's never going to happen. Right? So look, I'm not an economist for big government, and everybody who knows me will know that, right? I generally seem to think that people should be more free to pursue their own ideals, their own goals, without any kind of interference. But we have a problem with public services in this country. Even beyond corruption, even beyond efficiency, we just don't pay for public goods in Nigeria, and we need to figure out how to start to do that. And that has to start with collecting taxes. Now, like you said, there's a lot of taxes that don't get counted in the official tax numbers. When your policeman harasses you on the road, that's a tax. It doesn't make it to tax to GDP. When you have to transport goods from one town to the other, and an agency or a union collects money from your hand, that's a tax. It doesn't make it. Where does it
go to? Perhaps
it goes into private pockets. Right? But those are taxes that people pay that don't make it into the official numbers. So there's a whole structural problem there, where it's not just about collecting more taxes, but you need to deal with some of these non-state actors that collect taxes on their own, but don't provide any public goods.
How should we know? I know in your remarks and in what you've been saying, you've been proffering solutions. But it seems that the problem, is it bigger than what we're really seeing? you know, in terms of, I keep on talking about this economic dysfunctionality, and I hope they listen to me, because with what, at least with what I'm saying, there's a lot more we need to do, especially to, I want to say, to resuscitate the economy, because we should be doing better than we're doing right now. And that is why we are seeing the symptoms everywhere. Unemployment, the insecurity problem is going on. We have banditry now. Even here in Abuja, the security situation is very bad. You know, perhaps years ago you'd be thinking, oh, it happens in Maiduguri, it will not reach here. And I remember years ago I said, we need to fix this problem, because before you know it, it will get to you. We don't know who is next. And it's coming. That was like years ago. Go find out. Go YouTube it and see when I said it. So those are symptoms already happening. How can we, should we, how does that boldness begin, you know, so that we begin to address these problems from the root and not the symptoms? Because it's there, and we're seeing it. Hunger, starvation, suicidal rates, unemployment, insecurity. Is anyone not seeing this thing?
You see,
no, so you are smiling, or perhaps you are the economist. I don't know
I
whether
think
my own
Nonso,
economist
I agree
is
with you.
different.
Nonso is part of the 1% that are at the top of the pyramid. You know, he's not really feeling.
I would hope I am, but I don't think so.
You know, but I really think that we need a leadership that is transformational in their thinking, right? Again, pardon me, but I'm a political scientist by background. I don't believe that. I don't believe in the bottom-up approach. That's not possible, right? Even the whole essence of governance does not even support changes from the bottom, except it's a revolution, right? So, and you don't want a revolution, right? So, what the role of government, government, setting up of government is a social contract amongst the people. If you leave people to govern themselves or to come up with initiatives, everybody, you know, opposition theory says that human nature is nasty, you know, brutish and short. We want to kill the other person, take his property. You know, we can't do that. That's the whole idea of government. So government has to provide the framework for transformation. We need to find a way to drive cultural thinking. We have to be able to drive. I mean, and it has happened. Look at what is happening in Rwanda. Look at what happened in Ghana. Right? Look at what happened in Singapore.
Rwanda is making cars now.
Yes.
Making electric cars. They're making phones. They're doing a lot of things now. Though a lot of people still dispute those figures coming from Rwanda, but
they are still on average poorer than Nigeria.
Yes.
Well, on the average, yes.
On the average. But you can see perhaps some tangible
some indices, right?
Indices.
So we need to build a national reorientation, and it has to start from the top. Now I'll give you an example, right? We had consistent we've had 20 years of consistent democratic experiment, right? And for every election cycle, it has always come with high hopes, because we expect that the leader will be transformational. But they come in and they continue with the same business as usual, right? So I believe that, yes, it's a PDP or APC thing, because the parties are the framework, they are the platforms upon which we exist in terms of political governance. So I think that whichever party comes into the picture, today it is President Muhammadu Buhari, he needs to start adopting transformational thinking. When you look at...
he's not doing that already?
I don't...
A lot of the social investment, he introduced it. There's a social welfare system, conditional account transfer, and power. Despite there was UN at that time, a lot of things.
You can't say in spite. You can't say in spite. There has always been some form of all of these things right from the start. And we know that these things, there's again, another big gap that government usually fails to do is a proper, rigorous social impact assessment of these initiatives. Yes, you will do it, do a lot of media hype, a lot of pictures, optics and all that. But by the time you go to the base and measure the impact, right, you see that it is not even scratching the surface. Because at the middle line, right, a lot of corruption has swiped it, which is why I didn't agree with him about yes, he's right that we need to collect more revenue. But we don't have to raise, because what we are even collecting today is not what we are declaring.
Okay.
A lot is lost in the middle.
No, so finally, because we have to go.
Yes, I think Nigeria's structural problems are beyond just one person. I think it's beyond just President Buhari or the current executive. I think we need a new elite or political consensus on how to move the country forward. Just to give an example, if you want to change the tax structure today, you have to have a constitutional amendment. That's not something that President Buhari can do on his own. Not something the National Assembly can do on its own. It has to be a broad political agreement that this is where we want to move to. I think that's the big challenge that we face. Every government comes and tries to, scrape a bit, do a bit, but without tackling the big fundamental problem, that Nigeria isn't structured as a country that can be dynamic in the 21st century. That's the problem, and it's beyond just one person or one party. It's a national problem.
Issue.
Yeah,
because the issue for me, which I'm also looking at, I'm not looking at even which government is in power. It's President Buhari today, but for me, what I'm looking at is in the next 20 years, in the next 30, in the next 50 years, if we continue like this, would there really be a Nigeria? That's actually what I'm looking at in terms of the economics. And we really need to begin to discuss.
To transform.
Yes, begin to just. Anyway, let me just keep quiet. It's the end of the show. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I've been speaking with Nonso Obikili, an economist, the director at the Togot Center for Economic and Policy Research. I've also been joined by Ayo-Bankole, strategy consultant and SME expert.